Now, as always, we are joined to bring us inside the game by Maurice Brosnan, all the way from Australia. Maurice, how's it going? It was a great weekend. We've talked to Shane about the massive hurling games already, but like football was really to the fore this weekend as well. It's this crazy condensed championship. Actually, so much so, before we start, that Dublin were a goal up against old rivals Meath. The 6 in a row was within, or the 7 in a row was within touching distance of crumbling. And the whole country was watching the Munster final. Or, if you want to, conversely, if you want to look at it the other way, is like Munster final, hurling final, one of the marquee events of the summer. And, you know, you want the GAA community, not necessarily just people in hurling counties watching it. It's such a thrilling game. And you go on the Twitter timeline, and understandably, people from Dublin and Meath and other, like elsewhere as well, let's face it, are accounting for Meath's, you know, incredible comeback against the Dubs. You're just thinking, like, why are these two games on at the same time? I know we have a condensed format this year, but even so, surely this isn't the way they should be doing things.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, you know, I think I said this to you before, but you know, when you're abroad, the mild inconvenience of getting up early feels like a huge commitment. So you are a lot more invested in games. So if they're poor games, you know, you're mortally offended. You know, like I can remember times during Kerry and Tip where, you know, it was like an existential crisis for me. I was like, what am I doing? Like, why am I getting up to watch this game, this boring game? So conversely, on the other side of that, when you get a good game, you know, you're beyond grateful. It's unbelievably enthralling. I don't know what it is. And so, you know, you mentioned the me game, but it's just something about it. So from my own personal circumstances here in Melbourne, getting up, you know, switching over from a Tip in Limerick, and just the pure buzz, and you're nearly emotional, like the sound of the crowd, everything, watching that second half as Limerick is coming back in, sipping over to the Munster, you know, from Munster to Leinster, and the buzz in that ground as well, you know, and that we've mentioned this before about the importance of the crowd, but you know, the sound of the crowd, the absolute, you know, you could hear the Dublin fans olaying, Meath fans booing, there's a genuine tension in a Leinster final. And I was, you know, as great and as positive as you want to be about that, I was kind of thinking it's a real shame that I didn't, you know, or a lot of people didn't get to experience this from the offset, didn't get to see this build. You know, it's like the condensed calendar is a problem. I'm talking about that a lot. I'm also, you know, I've been non-stop complaining about the TV offerings. You know, I just think in 2021 what we're getting is just, it's not good enough, really. You know, from other than, I think punditry this year has been very good, but other than that, from everything from, you know, whatever, be camera work, be scheduling, I just think it's not right. You know, I'm sure, you know, you were probably the same watching Clare the day before. Suddenly, you know, Laois and Waterford, an unbelievably unbelievably exciting game. I had to watch it back the next day because that game, the two games were going up against each other, the same sport, going up against each other. When we have a condensed calendar, you know, it's not like, you know, this is understandable for something like a league, but you're talking about championship, you know, a do or die game. This is probably the last we'll see of two of these teams, and you're competing against, you know, the one code. It just feels, yeah, if something feels off about it, it does. It's very frustrating. You know, I don't know if you can have even just an hour's leeway. I'm sure there's television or whatever it is. Leeway, but you know, at the same time, the Dublin game wasn't even on TV. It was GAA Go. Exactly, so it is like I feel sore enough about it.
And it's funny you say even the hurling thing, like it's annoying, because if you're a Waterford fan or you're a Laois fan or any, like, just a general hurling fan who would like to watch that game as a thriller, you know, you're going to go towards the bigger game if you're a neutral or if you're a Clare and Wexford fan, and it's kind of a mild inconvenience. But in this particular case, it didn't make any sense to me that they were on up against each other. But in general, over the course of a championship, that might happen, and you're kind of saying, fine, look, we don't get to see every game and so on and so forth, right? And we never did. But I think with something like this, when GAA Go is available and you can buy in this match for a $5, or you might have a season pass or whatever it is, it's like, why would you split a GAA audience between people who like football and people like hurling, when there's so much room for both? And it's one of the issues that across the association, I just feel like making a decision like that yesterday, I just amplifies how much, in my opinion, it doesn't seem to matter to the people who run things, that we're getting more and more every year, I think, into more of a hurling crowd and a football crowd. We're actually one of the few podcasts left that actually cover both sports, if you know what I mean. And understandably so. People do say, oh, we'll have a hurling show, we'll have a football show, you know. Anyway, let's move on to the football itself, right? Because what I noticed is that undeniable fact now that the 7 in a row is gone. Desi Farrell should probably do a Babs Keating on it, and they should get Michael Bond in to maybe rescue the season. There's no chance that Dublin come back from beating the 8th best team in the country by 6 points it's done. Kerry basically booking the parade at this stage. With maybe Tyrone sort of hanging around, or Mayo sort of thinking maybe they have a chance they can feed on the scraps, but Kerry favourites, and then you have Tyrone and Mayo looking on, and then Kildare really probably the only other team that are sort of thinking of, maybe Kildare and Monaghan being the others that could have a chance of sniffing out the All-Ireland yet.
Yeah, I don't. I obviously don't see it being as black and white as that. I don't think you do either. But at the same time, there is this is the most vulnerable Dublin have been for me in arguably a decade. Or longer. 2014 was such a shock that wasn't coming. I personally didn't see that as Dublin being vulnerable. So kind of from 2013 onwards, you saw this juggernaut building. And then, the thing about me, we're going to talk about structures later in terms of game plans and tactically. But the thing with Dublin is, it's nothing to do with structure, or I don't think it's, a lot of people are talking about their players are missing. I don't think it's personnel. There's something deeper, more intrinsically wrong to my mind with this Dublin team. It's weird. It's really weird to watch Dublin trying to close out a game, and in a row, Kieran Kilkenny, with a better option available, kick a wide from inside 21. Was he there at the end of the game? A couple of minutes later, Bugler, who has been heralded as the new wave of hard-working, dogged wing forwards for Dublin, kicks another wide on the same side. Davy Byrne gets a ball directly in front of goal, inside the 45, and drops into a keeper's hands. That's 3 in a row. I don't know how much you can necessarily read into it. I'm sure Dublin have always been training in terms of periodization. They're peaking for a final, I would imagine. But it's very weird to see these really uncharacteristic mistakes Dublin make. It's just not like them. And as much as you want to give Meath credit, and they were really dogged, and they hung in. Looking back over it, the game looked like it was getting away from them. They came tearing back, but at the same time, well, it's not to take away from how good Meath were, to say that Dublin were way off it. Way off the standards. If you were to compare that Dublin, the way they were in that kind of middle third period, to the Dublin that blitzed Mayo in that famous semi-final 2 years ago, it's chalk and cheese. It's absolutely polar opposites, and that to me is the most striking thing, that the players who are making mistakes, James McCarthy getting involved in stuff constantly getting involved in stuff, Brian Fenton kicking the ball away, this is stuff that we just wouldn't. These are you can say the players are missing, and that's definitely one, it's a factor undeniably, but at the same time this stuff is deeper to my mind. Those mistakes just aren't the Dublin that we know mistakes.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I've no issue with talking about vulnerability and the fact that it might be a more competitive championship and they're there to be got. And I think that's actually brilliant. That's amazing for the game, that there is genuine people who can win. But the idea that they're being written off, I feel like if the two halves had been flipped around, we'd be talking about them in the same way we're talking about Limerick today. Limerick definitely I mean, you were talking about this yesterday. I talked about it with Shane already, but Limerick were definitely lacking the famous I word that we're not allowed to talk about in analysis of intensity. But when they picked it up, they showed what they could do, and I think that's harder to do when you've got the lead like Dublin did yesterday. And you just wonder. My concern with them would be it's not even personnel, because they've always had such great strength and depth. But when you lose Paul Mannion, you lose Jack McCaffrey, you lose Stephen Cluxton. Stephen Cluxton's just an island on his own, and how big a deal that is. And various others that have gone, but even little things like Eric Lowndes leaving the panel last week, right? The strength of I was looking at their bench yesterday going, now in fairness, a lot of these guys could end up being amazing, but I just don't know that yet. As in we haven't seen the usual 5 years of them making regular championship appearances without making a massive impact and then suddenly becoming the main player on the team. That's the way Dublin have been doing it, because they've been so good for so long, in much the way Kilkenny used to do that. Now we're kind of looking at guys being thrown in. If you want to change a game, you're going to have to bring in unheralded, unknown guys, and I just think that's a question mark, massive question mark. And then you're talking about maybe that there isn't the same cohesion, because we forget another personnel change in Jim Gavin to Desi Farrell. I know they've won All Ireland since, but you can't discount that either. So it's all to play for, which is great, isn't it?
Yeah, I like it. There's two things you said there that I think are really good points. One is, there is 100% within this, the conversation about Dublin over the last couple of weeks is the barometer we set for this Dublin team is so high that we would get massively excited by what was a fairly comfortable Leinster semi-final, win, ultimately, so that's definitely 100% a factor. And the second thing is just the fact that the inevitability that was around this team isn't there when as you mentioned, these aren't players that we've seen do it before. It just adds a question mark. And look at the balance probability, they probably are still good enough. This is an elite level team that has run a production line like the likes of which we've never seen. But just the fact that there is that question mark is great. It's exactly what the game needs. It'll get you a lot more excited. In terms of like we've had what was a fairly underwhelming championship until now. Suddenly it just adds a dimension that we in reality like we haven't had for as I said, like probably 8 or 9 years.
Yeah. Okay. The one other thing I noticed, even though I said, like, you have Paddy Small, Con, and Costello and Dean Rock all playing, and the funny thing is, like, they're easily 4 of the best 6 forwards in Dublin. Before, they wouldn't have all fit into the same team, and there just wasn't room for them, and it was as simple as that. It was like, we're going to have to drop one of these top players. But now they all start, and I remember there was a little moment just looking at the team sheets yesterday when I was going, that's a sign that there isn't as much there as there was, Anyway, we'll see what happens. They've got Kildare next, and Leinster final in a couple of weeks. But it was all about Ulster this weekend, really. Like, I mean, an unbelievable game on Saturday, played like under the shadow of this awful tragedy. But, the way Monaghan came out and blitzed Armagh so early, and for Armagh to come back and so on, it had its own story as well. Like, it was one of the best games of football I can remember. 2014 All-Ireland semi-finals between Kerry and Mayo jumped straight to mind. It was that kind of thing, possibly with a slightly dip in quality in terms of defensiveness, I would say. And then yesterday, this intriguing game as well. Less exciting, I would say, in many ways, but in terms of its consequences, almost far higher, So, like, in terms of, like, I know it was funny because watching Pat Spillane and Sean Cavan at the start of the broadcast yesterday, trying to big up Ulster football and Pat apologising and so on and so forth. It was a bit of dramedy basically with that. But it is true that Ulster football is so turned on its head now that it's like, instead of going, oh God, I couldn't watch that, I have to watch it because I have to talk about it tomorrow. It's like, this is the one I'm looking forward to, and I want to. It's like the other stuff is the stuff I'll watch because of duty.
Yeah, and this is I was thinking about this like last night actually when I was watching the game. To a certain extent, because of what you're saying there, I wonder. I was going to come on. I was going to talk about Tyrone and structurally, and you like nearly laud them for what they did. Because they didn't blink. They pushed up on the kickouts. They got their matchups right. They they left 2 up, and then I was kind of thinking, actually, this just justifies our criticism for the last couple of years. I don't necessarily think this stuff it's not that innovative, to be honest. This is stuff we should have seen before. I don't know how much. I kind of, in hindsight now, I think back. Obviously, look at they executed it very well, and they're in the final. But I don't know if I would, overplay the significance of what they did, because this is like nobody ever called for revolution when it came to their criticism of these teams. It's been a big topic recently, is this idea of defensive football. And I personally now, I can speak for anybody else. I don't think I would ever criticize the team for setting up defensively, but I would criticize the team for having a bad game plan. We talked about this, 2 weeks ago with Roscommon. I didn't criticize Roscommon for defending, criticize them for setting up a way that doesn't suit their players. You'd 4 forwards who weren't suited to playing that game. So either commit to what you're trying to do or get a game that you get the best out of what's at your disposal. But falling between 2 stools is just that's where the criticism comes in, and I think there's definitely a case for Tyrone within that. And then, even, in that conversation, there's 2 things. I think we'll come back to this again and again, this championship. You've got, like, is it about the players, and as we the dreaded intensity and the conversation about that, and then the structure, and what comes first? Is it the application or is it the structures? And in reality it's both. It's not one or the other. So there's not a structure in the world that would have compensated for Armagh's defending for the first goals in the first half, those first 4 goals. Other than setting up with 4 sweepers inside your goal mouth, you will not stop a player running down the middle, a 1-2 hand pass, a 1-2 hand pass and scoring a goal. Like Jim McGuinness said at halftime, that's, if you saw that in under 12s, you'd be like, listen, like that's not how we play football. So there's no structure. It's not about Ulster football. It's nothing about that. That is just application. That's just, whatever it is, mental lapse. I think they started very, very slowly. Armagh started very, very slowly yesterday. And then the other conversation then is about the structures, and it's about what that gives you. And I think that's where Tyrone, players brought it. They've got unbelievable athletes. I think that really told at the end how quickly they finished. And you look at the way they lined up in the middle third. Like you look at Sludden, Hart, McGeary, Myler just romping forward, Burns. That's another level of whatever you want to call it, intensity, if you want to go down that route. But at the same time, then they have a structure around that allows them to get the most out of disposal. So they're leaving 2 up, which is great to see. So even if they don't actually use that, the option is there, and that's where I think that's where. What I personally, what I was always calling for, it's just it's about a balance. It's not one or the other. It's about if you set up, you can get a blank. The idea of setting up a blanket defense is all fine and good, and you get low players behind the ball. But what do you do when you have the ball? If you don't have a structure as an outlet, as a player up the field, what do you do? You're running the ball up the field, and suddenly that becomes a lot more easier to defend against, because as a defender, their only option here is to put head down and drive forward. And that for me, that was so patently obvious this weekend. So you go back to the first McGeary's first score. What happens there? Morgan pings this kick out set play that they do over and over again, which is kind of in over the midfield. They pull everyone to one side, clear out that side, and just it's like a race. So Peter Hart races onto the ball, and the reason he's fouled there isn't because they want to stop Peter Hart running the ball. The reason they fouled there is because Peter Hart looks up and he sees McGeary inside in the edge of square, one-on-one before McFadden, the sweeper, can drop back. So that option is there now. So even though they don't use it, the pressure is on the defence. We need to get to him. We need to stop him because he can do that. And sure enough, they get the free, they kick a score from that free. And that happened again and again. The fact that you look at McGeary's first score when he, I don't know if you remember, he's coming down the right. McFadden tries to come across to him and he gets the ball over the bar. But the reason McFadden can't go and pressure the man with the ball is because he's conscious that if I leave space, they will kick past the ball into this area. That option is there. So even though they don't do that, the fact that they have that option, that's the threat that they want. What the greatest example of this actually is, Mick? It's not even Gaelic football, it's hurling. I put this clip up on Twitter if anybody didn't see it. Anthony Daly did some good analysis on Sunday game last night. He called it the dagger. And it's a point just before the water break. Kilkenny, the pressing, like this savage work rate that it's become the Cody mantra up the field, harrying Dublin. And initially I was like, that was it's if anybody hasn't seen it, it's an incredible score. It's just classic Kilkenny, tackle, turnover score. And but at the same time, I was watching that and I was like, why didn't Dublin, Rush is one of them, why didn't you just pump the ball, get rid of it? Yeah. And the reason he didn't pump the ball is because you watched the play before that, and the way that score comes down the other wing, right, Kilkenny's other side, and you look at on the 65, Paddy Deegan has the ball, and pressure them there is Crummy, Cian O'Sullivan, Donald Burke, they're all Sutcliffe, all there surrounding them, which means when Dublin get the ball back, they have no outball, they have no option, and this is the way they have committed to play. They need all their players to work like dogs and get back. But if from Rush's perspective, he's there and he's saying to himself, if I puck this ball to the field, we're guaranteed to lose it. It's a 1-on-1, 1-on-4, maybe 1-on-3 at best, but we are guaranteed to lose it. If I carry the ball out, it might be, a 30% chance that we hold on to the ball, but this is the only option I have. So if you don't give yourself that option, whether that be, this is any team, this could be Tyrone, this could be Donegal, this could be Dublin, any hurling, Gaelic football, it's true for any sport. If you don't give yourself that option, you become predictable. And that's, that's what, certainly from my perspective, that's what I'm critical of. It was never ever about game plans. It was never ever about your strategies, your approaches, set up however you want. But if it's predictable, it's easy to stop. And that's, the greatest telling point of all this was a lot of times the teams did that, they were losing.
Yeah. So like if you're relying always on runners outside you to kind of work the ball up, then that's, you do what Kilkenny does and defend from behind and from the side. Darren McCurry was actually the focus of you talking about this on the GAA Embedded article you did for Balls during the week that people should go back and read. And it's a lot of what you were talking about there, and a slightly more positive outlook from Tyrone in that way of just like making sure that there is that outlet there. But it's funny because if you look at this year of like McKenna kind of back, obviously he was back last year, but kind of back full time in the setup this year, and you would have thought that Colin McShane would probably have at this stage probably a bigger role. We'll probably see him a little bit more later in the year. It's Darren McCurry wasn't the person we were thinking of as going to be Tyrone's marquee forward, but again, on yesterday, he's showing at this stage that he is kind of the man for them at the moment. It's been a long time coming with this guy as well. Yeah,
it definitely has. And what's interesting about, like, from McCurry, for me, this goes back to what we talked about in that article. I talked about the idea Sean Kavanagh had, it was like you got a fairly heated debate within Tyrone and outside Tyrone when Sean Kavanagh moved into punditry, and fairly early on he was critical of he said it was the famous thing was Tyrone do have marquee forwards, but we don't get the best out of them. So, and that goes back to our conversation earlier. Is it about players or is it about their approach? And as I said, it's about both. So, there's definitely things McCurry could have done better previously. There's definitely things Tyrone could have done to help him. But now, the structure, the whole point is that, you can see the structure is set up so that even if McCurry doesn't necessarily fire, like at times yesterday, I would have been critical enough of how McCurry played. He kicked that the wide on the right from an impossible angle, and that was actually off what we're talking about here. That was a kick pass, a deep kick pass. He gets the ball, spins around, and the reason he's trying to kick that score straight away is because he knows if he holds onto the ball or tries to recycle it, Donegal is really mobile, kind of middle third, will come back and swallow him. So once the kick pass is in, you kind of need to make most use of it. He'd also the one in the second half where they pushed up and Patton's kick out, the ball breaks, falls at his feet, and again he snaps shot at it. But the whole, as I said earlier, the whole point is that even if McCurry doesn't necessarily have to fire if you have this structure, because he can set it up for somebody else. So how many times did you see McCurry get as that option, break, get on the ball, and then suddenly he's swarmed with runners. So you're combined, you're supporting the supply of the ball inside, and the only reason you can do that in reality is if you have runners. So if you have, these like savage athletes that Tyrone have to help support him. So he's not operating in isolation now because he has players supporting him. He's also in a structure that gets the best out of him. So even if he doesn't necessarily fire, suddenly at the very end of the game, Matty Donnelly comes to the fore, and is that score he kicked at the very end of the game, or he hand passed over the bar, on the loop. That's a classic example of what we're talking about here. He doesn't have to, because he's not back harrying out the ball, when Tyrone get that ball back and move it quickly, he's an option already there. He's just there, it's an outlet. So previously what would happen there is Tyrone would build, they'd be running the ball forward, and that's, as I said, that's suddenly when Donegal, the way the games would go, and the reason we'd get so frustrated by it is the team would run the ball forward, they'd come up to outside 45, recycle, the other team would drift back with them, pressurize there, recycle, try and work a scoring option, either a turnover or score, same thing back, and it's very kind of basketball-like. The fact now that you have some bit of variance, even if you don't use it, the fact that the option is there, that means that when those players are set up defensively on front on the 45, they know now that, listen, I have to be conscious of in behind me, because they could just as easily kick this ball in to McCurry or Donnelly as, McGeary or somebody else can run past me. So even if they don't do it, the fact that the option is there is the whole point of what we're talking about here. You just give, it's not about what it does for you, it's what it does to the opposition. It's an added question that will inevitably lead to higher scores, and lead to more productivity for your attackers.
Yeah, not as a productive a game, I suppose, but I did think he had kind of the middle third of the match. I thought that he had some big influence, but worth a read on Maurice's piece on Balls.ie for what he's talking about there. And again, one other thing to emphasize as well is that it's not as if these guys have free roll that they can't work. They do harry, and they do all the pressing, and they do all the tackling in their area. They just don't chase it all the way back to the opposition goal. They say they have positions, and they which is great, but you still have to work as hard in those positions as you do anywhere else.
Exactly. I'm really glad you said that. That's actually a great point, because the best example of that is the Donegal penalty. The reason defensive teams will point to the downside of this kind of stuff is because, if you look back on that penalty, it's a ferocious press. Tyrone are fully committed players up the field trying to get the ball. But as soon, like I was watching that, and as soon as Donegal managed to get the ball to Patton and move up the other side, straight away you're sitting forward and you think something's going to happen here, because too many Tyrone players are now on the wrong side of the ball. So when they get that press on, they really need to get a stop, or as you see, they're overran and it ends in could end in a goal chance. In this case, it ends in a penalty. But that's the downside of of this approach, and this is the same for any sport. When you press high like that, and if you can bypass that press, suddenly you're in trouble because you're exposed on the other side. So that's the and by the way, when we talked about the art of defending a couple of weeks ago, Mick, this was the point of what we were saying. If you're a one-on-one defender and you're standing beside a guy, put a pressure on the man delivering the ball, that's when you give your defenders a bit of a chance, because the ball won't be perfect. They can spoil it, they can try and break it then. But so it does, like as I said before, all this stuff is interconnected. If you're pressing the ball, maybe you don't necessarily get a turnover, but that pressure on the ball can definitely damage. And simultaneously, if you're in opposition and you can see a team get that high press, if you can get past it, you, like as Donegal did, you have to get in and goal. That's when you can make hay in that opportunity, because you have numbers.
Yeah, absolutely, and you have to balance it up, because I actually find this interesting. We'll move on, because I want to talk about something else. But you have to remember now, especially even more so now, football is a high scoring game. It's not like soccer where one goal will define everything or whatever. You have to play in the way that suits you getting the better over 70 minutes. If you concede some over that time, that's just the cost of the business. And it's the first time in a generation, maybe two generations, where there's been that sort of acceptance. Cost of doing business is conceding a little bit. And it's great, and it's made it such a better game to watch. But it's also, you've more chance of winning because you're playing to your strengths. And we're literally gone full circle to the start of this conversation. Then and I think that sums it up. What about the losers here? But just really briefly, because for Armagh, it's like they haven't won 2 games in Ulster. I don't know how long it is. I think since the last time they were in an Ulster final, which is like 10 years ago or something like that, right? They only beat Antrim this year, but they had that 25 minutes where they were outstanding, and they stayed up in Division 1, and it might keep them on for another year of development. They've got such really good players, especially up the field. And then for Donegal, it's like another year of promise that ends, really been killed for 2 years in a row now by having no back door, I would say, and then just like overdone. Michael Murphy has the worst 10 minutes of his career, where he picks up 2 bookings and misses a penalty in the middle of it. And Neil McGee's already gone off injured, and you're like, shit, we're done here. And I like, if that was a 15-15 game for more than the 30 minutes that it was, we don't know who would be. I think Donegal would have won the game, but I don't know that either. I mean, that's unfair to Tyrone, but it was kind of done as soon as he was sent off.
Yeah, like it's interesting because, like you could make a case there's very similarities between these two teams in terms of, that both management have had big long spells, been trying to develop a very consistent game plan. And yet still, to my mind, I really hate hindsight analysis, and I think Armagh gave themselves a really good opportunity to win the game against Monaghan, and they just fell short of the line because of they started so poorly and they probably ran out a bit of legs. But if I was looking forward, I don't think you blow up the script by any stretch of imagination. They've got some really good, you look at the lads they brought on, Ross McQuillan back from Melbourne now. There's a lot of excitement about him here, in Essendon, that they seem to have a lot of. You see him coming off the bench, like it'd be interesting to see how he develops. Connor Turbert coming off the bench again, and Tiernan Kelly. The 3 of them alone, the impact that they had from an Armagh perspective. So Armagh strike me as a team that are building, and like this might seem harsh, but you're looking at a generational Donegal team and generational talents like Michael Murphy and Neil McGee going off injured, and I don't see, as good as their young development players are, it's just purely because the barometer that they'll step other teams. I don't see a similar level of player coming, so I think this is a much bigger loss for Donegal. It does feel like the end of something for them. Whereas even though it doesn't make sense because McGeaney, he was there when he was appointed, was it 2015, 2014, and has a good long crack at it. I still see a huge amount of positivity around Armagh, whereas it's really hard to see what Donegal do next. I think they will always be around this level. They will always be competitive, but in terms of getting to that next level, getting to the I'd probably make a case they're not even in the top tier, really. You look back on the Cavan game, I know, listen, they're shuffled from back door, but that was a bad loss. The biggest one for me was the Mayo game down in Castlebar, when the reliance on Michael Murphy was just so badly exposed that day. And he was simultaneously, he was the best player on the pitch, but he was also the worst player on the pitch because he was taking on shots that he shouldn't be taking on, he was kicking wides. And the reason he was doing that is because there's nobody else there to do it for him. So, I think that's, I don't see them, declining drastically by any stretch of imagination, but I also don't see where the big improvement comes for them. I don't see the huge upside, and I do see that for Armagh. Yeah.
Well, interesting one, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about Monaghan, and we've kind of glossed over them, but in many ways, what a performance in their forwards. And it's just, I don't know, I'm loving the new Conor McManus, not the main guy role. With McCarron kind of taking over, and he still oozes this class that you see 7 times a game, and that's it really, and then McCarron is sort of dominating. I don't know, I just think Monaghan, very, very good team, possibly underrated, but you would worry that they let Armagh come back into it, and we've already talked about Tyrone. If you were to call next weekend's games, then Cork and Kerry. Darren said that Cork had no chance last week. Would you go along with that? You're 2 counties, you're a Kerry and Galway man, so it's a big weekend.
Yeah, I kind of would. I don't. Cork kind of would frustrate me a big time. You look back on how they played against Limerick, and last 10 minutes they're only up by 4. If it wasn't for that goal, which is a very poor goal for Limerick to concede, it's a game there. Only 2 of their starting forwards scored. They have this really mobile 4. I don't see how you change that, because you actually they need to start Roy Dean, Brian Hartnett, because they're going to have to track. If Kerry go the way they did last week with Gavin White, Thomas Sullivan, and Breen on the other wing, Cork have to track them, and I just don't see how they carry that threat. They set a trap for Kerry last year, and Kerry happily walked blindfolded into it, but I don't see them doing that again. So unless they can do something different, I did think the only case I can make for Cork is when they, in the second half, when they brought on Mark Collins, and they had, Luke Connolly tried to do this job. I don't know how well it worked on the 45s, kind of outball, and you had options inside. They brought on Michael Hurley. Brian Hurley is just an unbelievable bit of stuff. This goes back to our conversation earlier about a kicking game versus a running game. But if they're committed to this game where they've got a mobile third, you're going to have to run the ball. I don't see them getting enough chance to break the way, you don't get Kerry will be naive again. So if they did something like that, maybe, but no, but to be honest, I think Kerry are moving too well, and they demonstrated the necessary intelligence against Tipperary that I don't think they'll be caught again.
All right, yeah. Well, we thought that last year, but I tend to agree. And then lastly, it's a Connacht final in Croke Park for the first time ever. If you any, is this one of the weekends that you kind of say, Jesus, I wouldn't mind now being back in the old sod, or are you happy enough to get up
big
early
time.
in the morning?
No, big time. They're going. You know, I was thinking this at the weekend. You know, like because I'm driving demented by the poor TV offerings that I keep bringing up. People on my Twitter know too well how frustrated I am. So the fact that you can't get at games, I really think if you're not at games, you've been doing such a disservice by the offerings. That's a conversation for another day. But I just don't think, you know, we're missing kickouts. Like some of the camera work at the weekend was pretty poor. There's games I can't even watch. So you don't appreciate that. And then secondly, you know, just this is a rivalry that's been, you know, like Galway were, you know, it was one of the biggest sore points in Galway for years. I'm talking here about 2014, 2015, when they got a couple of scutcheons off Mayo. There was a 3 in a row at the time. And since then, they've really come back. I was in at the qualifier when Mayo bet them Kevin Walsh's final game of that reign. And since then, you know, all the stuff that we wanted Galway to start moving towards, I think it's been there. I think you look at the results, maybe not necessarily hasn't, but you have to consider the conditions at the same time. And I think this Galway team are motoring really nicely. You know, if you're looking for, I don't know, they're probably even enough. I think the way Galway are going, I would expect a huge performance out of them. I think they have this threat, they have the ability, you know, the huge men around the middle, but they have an out ball on the 45. Shane Walsh, by all accounts, it will be fit. You know, play him on the 45. Matthew Cheney around the middle. I think against Mayo, you might see Matthew Cheney go in on the edge of the square. He might actually start inside, and that'll be an interesting wrinkle, you know, because they have, you know, it might be Cook and Conroy maybe starting around the middle of the field, and you could see him further up the pitch, and suddenly then that changes the complexion of the whole kind of Galway attack. So I think, from my perspective, I think that what I've seen of Galway so far, I expect a huge result. I think that could be whatever about if I was to make a prediction, I think the Kerry and Cork game might be a bit underwhelming, but I think that game could be an absolute cracker. Both teams going at it the way that we want to see football being played, and both of them kind of motoring nicely, you know, if you got to judge their form before this.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, listen, thanks a million, Maurice. We look forward to those games next week, and we'll chat to you next week as well. Keep an eye on Balls.ie for your latest GAA Embedded article over the course of the week. And look, try and get some sleep now. I think it's like Monday to Wednesday is kind of your sleep opportunities, and then like kind of
recharge,
Thursday morning on, you're probably up watching the Olympics, you know, trying to fit in 15 or 16 GAA games a weekend. Actually, there's only 4 games on next weekend in the senior championships. I know you'll be probably trying to sneak in a few Christy Ring Cup games and as well. But anyway, Maurice, thanks a million for joining us. We'll be back with you next week.